Amara's hands were shaking when she found the calendar. Not because of what was written on it, but because of what was missing. Today's date had nothing next to it. No note, no reminder. Not even a small heart drawn in the corner the way Daniel used to do in their first year together. She stood in the kitchen holding the little paper calendar that hung by the fridge, and she felt something crack quietly inside her chest, like ice under careful footsteps. It was her 32nd birthday. She had woken up early that morning, humming a song from the radio, certain that today would be different. She had told herself this so many times before that the words had worn smooth, like stones rubbed by a river. Today will be different. Today he will remember. Today he will look at me the way he used to. Daniel had already left for work by the time she came downstairs. His coffee cup sat empty in the sink, rinsed but not washed, a small habit that used to annoy her and now barely registered at all. She picked it up anyway, turned on the tap, and watched the water spiral down the drain, thinking about how many mornings had passed exactly like this one. 6 years. 6 years since she had stood in a small chapel, wearing a dress that made her feel like the luckiest woman in the world, holding hands with a man who promised to cherish her. Cherish. That word had meant something once. Now it felt like a costume she wore to family dinners, something to explain why she still smiled when people asked how married life was treating her. She dried the cup and set it in the rack. Outside the window, a bird landed on the fence and tilted its head, watching her the way birds do, curious and unbothered. Amara envied it. Birds did not wait for anything. They simply lived. Her phone buzzed on the counter. For one bright second, hope flared in her chest, quick and embarrassing in its intensity. She grabbed the phone before she could stop herself. It was a message from her sister, Naomi. "Happy birthday, love. Call me later, okay? I have news." Amara typed back a heart emoji and set the phone down, trying to ignore the small disappointment settling over her like a fine layer of dust. She told herself it did not matter. Daniel was busy. He had an important meeting today, something about a new client, something he had mentioned 3 or 4 times over the past week, with more excitement in his voice than he had shown her in months. She got dressed for work, choosing a soft yellow blouse, because yellow had always made her feel brave. She looked in the mirror longer than usual, studying her own face, tracing the small lines near her eyes that had not been there when she married him. She was still pretty, she thought, still capable of being loved the way she used to be loved. She just needed to remember that herself, since it seemed nobody else was doing the remembering for her. At the office, her coworkers surprised her with a small cake during the lunch break. Someone had bought pink balloons and taped a handwritten sign to her desk that said "Happy Birthday, Amara" in bubble letters. She laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time all day, blowing out a single candle stuck crookedly into the frosting. "Big plans tonight?" asked Priya, one of her closest friends at work, licking frosting off her thumb. "Daniel's taking me somewhere," Amara said, and even as the words left her mouth, she realized she had made them up. He had not said that. She had simply assumed it, the way she assumed so many things about him now, filling in blanks with hope instead of fact. "Ooh, exciting. Where?" "He wants it to be a surprise," Amara said, and hated the ease with which the lie slipped out. It was easier to lie to her friends than to admit that she genuinely did not know if her husband remembered her birthday at all. The afternoon dragged. She kept checking her phone under her desk, waiting for a text, a call, anything. Nothing came. By the time she left the office at 6, the sky had turned a deep orange, the kind of color that used to make her want to grab Daniel's hand and walk slowly, just to watch it fade. She used to love sunsets. She was not sure when she had stopped noticing them. She drove home with the radio off, replaying old memories to keep herself company. She remembered their first apartment, tiny and cold in winter, how Daniel used to wrap both of them in a single blanket and read to her from paperback novels he found at second-hand shops. She remembered how he used to text her just to say he missed her, even if she had seen him only hours before. She remembered feeling like the center of someone's whole world. She did not know exactly when that feeling had started to fade. There was no single day she could point to, no dramatic fight, no terrible betrayal. It was more like erosion, a missed dinner here, a shortened phone call there, a birthday forgotten, then another, until she had trained herself not to expect much, because expecting less hurt less when nothing came. When she pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the porch light. Her stomach tightened with a strange mixture of hope and dread. Maybe he was inside, waiting with candles, a cake, an apology for being distracted lately. Maybe tonight would be the night everything shifted back to how it used to be. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled the same as always, faint traces of yesterday's dinner, laundry detergent, the woodsy candle she liked to burn in the evenings. No candles were lit now, no table was set. The living room sat exactly as she had left it that morning, cushions slightly crooked, a book open face down on the arm of the sofa. "Daniel?" she called out, though she already suspected the answer. Silence answered her. She walked through the house anyway, checking each room, as though he might be hiding somewhere with a surprise. Some grand gesture she simply had not thought to imagine yet. The bedroom was empty. The office was empty, his laptop closed and set neatly on the desk. The kitchen held nothing but yesterday's dishes and this morning's coffee stains. Her phone rang just as she was standing in the middle of the kitchen, feeling smaller than she had felt in years. It was Daniel. "Hey," he said, his voice rushed and slightly breathless. "Listen, I'm really sorry, but this meeting ran incredibly long. The client wants to extend the contract. It's a huge deal for us, and I need to stay and finalize a few things. I might be late." Amara closed her eyes, pressing the phone tighter against her ear. "Daniel," she said quietly, "do you know what today is?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, a pause that stretched just a little too long, filled with the faint sound of office chatter and a printer humming somewhere behind him. "It's Tuesday," he said finally, uncertain, clearly searching for the deeper meaning behind her question and not quite finding it. She almost laughed, though nothing about the moment felt funny. It was the kind of laugh that came from somewhere painful, a release valve for feelings too large to hold quietly. "It's my birthday," she said, and even as she said it, she hated how small her voice sounded, how much it revealed of the hurt she had promised herself she would not show him anymore. Another pause, heavier this time. "Amara, I am so sorry. I completely forgot. Work has just been insane lately. You know that. Let me make it up to you this weekend. I promise. We will do something special." She wanted to believe him. Some stubborn, hopeful part of her still wanted to believe every promise he made, the way she had believed them years ago, when promises were still new and shining, and mostly kept. But she had heard versions of this sentence too many times before. This weekend. Next week. Soon. The words had become empty containers, promises with nothing solid left inside them. "Sure," she said instead, keeping her voice steady. "Take your time at work. I'll see you when you get home." She hung up before he could say anything else, before the disappointment in her voice could fully break through the careful composure she had built. She set the phone down on the counter and stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular, feeling the quiet ache of a day that had promised so much and delivered so little. She thought about calling Naomi, telling her everything, letting herself cry the way she wanted to. But she did not. Instead, she poured herself a glass of wine, sat at the kitchen table alone, and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to feel sorry for herself. She had learned, over the years, that 10 minutes was usually enough. After that, she would clean the kitchen, maybe read a few chapters of the novel sitting on her nightstand, and go to bed before Daniel came home, so she would not have to see his tired, apologetic face and pretend, once again, that it was completely fine. But something felt different tonight. As she sat there, swirling the wine gently in her glass, she noticed a strange stillness inside her chest, a stillness that had nothing to do with acceptance and everything to do with quiet exhaustion. She was tired, not of Daniel exactly, but of the waiting itself, tired of counting missed birthdays and canceled dinners the way other people counted blessings. Tired of building her entire emotional world around scraps of attention thrown her way between meetings and deadlines. She thought of her mother, years ago, telling her that love was patient, that good marriages required sacrifice and endurance. She had believed that deeply, had built her whole understanding of love around it. But sitting here now, in a dark kitchen on her birthday, she wondered for the first time whether patience without reciprocity was not a virtue at all, but a slow kind of disappearing. She finished her wine and rinsed the glass, placing it carefully in the rack beside Daniel's coffee cup. She turned off the kitchen light and walked upstairs, pausing at the bedroom door to look at the neatly made bed, the matching pillows, the photograph of their wedding day sitting on the dresser in a simple silver frame. In the photograph, she was laughing at something just outside the camera's view, and Daniel was looking at her instead of the camera, his whole face soft with adoration. She picked up the frame and studied it closely, searching for the exact moment that man had begun to fade into the distracted, distant husband who forgot her birthday and called it Tuesday. She did not find an answer in the photograph. Photographs rarely held the answers people searched for in them. She set it down gently and got ready for bed, brushing her teeth, washing her face, changing into the soft cotton pajamas she liked best. As she slipped under the covers, she noticed, almost without meaning to, that she did not feel the sharp sting of hurt she expected. Instead, she felt something quieter, something that unsettled her more than tears would have, a kind of numbness, gentle and unfamiliar, as though a part of her had simply stopped hoping for the evening to turn out differently, long before it actually had. She lay in the dark, listening to the house settle around her, the faint creak of old wood, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. She thought about tomorrow, about the ordinary rhythm of her days, waking early, making coffee, driving to work, coming home to a house that felt more like a place she managed than a home she shared. She thought about the years ahead, stretching out in front of her like a long, quiet road, and she wondered, honestly wondered, whether she wanted to keep walking it the same way she had been. Just as her eyes grew heavy, she heard the front door open downstairs, followed by Daniel's footsteps moving quietly through the house, careful not to wake her. She heard him pause outside the bedroom door, heard the soft click of the handle turning slowly. She kept her eyes closed and her breathing even, pretending to be asleep, though sleep felt very far away. He came in, changed quietly in the dark, and slipped into bed beside her, his familiar weight settling the mattress the way it had for 6 years. He shifted closer, wrapping an arm gently around her waist, and murmured a soft apology into the darkness, so quiet she almost missed it. "I really am sorry, Amara. I'll make it up to you, I promise." She did not answer. She lay still, feeling the warmth of his arm around her, a warmth that used to feel like safety, and now felt oddly distant, like sunlight filtered through thick glass. She waited for the familiar rush of forgiveness to rise up inside her chest, the way it always had before, softening her resolve, making her want to turn toward him and whisper that it was okay, that she understood. But tonight, that rush did not come. Instead, she lay quietly in the dark beside the man she had married, feeling his breathing slow into sleep, and she realized, with a clarity that frightened her slightly, that some small essential part of her had already begun letting go, long before she had consciously decided to. It was not anger she felt. It was not even sadness. Not fully. It was something quieter and more permanent. A shift so subtle Daniel would not notice it for a very long time. Somewhere in the stillness of that ordinary, disappointing birthday, Amara had stopped waiting for him to change. She simply did not know it yet. The knife slipped from Amara's hand and clattered against the cutting board, startling her out of a memory she had not meant to fall into. She had been slicing vegetables for dinner, her mind drifting somewhere far from the kitchen, back to the birthday that had passed 3 weeks earlier, without ceremony or apology, beyond a single quiet promise Daniel had never followed through on. She picked the knife back up and continued chopping, more carefully this time, forcing her attention onto the task in front of her. The kitchen radio played softly in the background, a station that mixed old songs with new ones, the kind of background noise that filled silence without demanding much attention. Daniel was late again. Not dramatically late, not late enough to worry, just late enough that dinner would go cold on the table before he arrived. Late enough that the candle she had lit earlier, hoping to make an ordinary Tuesday feel a little special, had already burned halfway down. She had stopped asking him to be home for dinner months ago. It felt easier to simply cook, eat when she was hungry, and set aside a plate for him to reheat whenever he walked through the door. Somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that this arrangement counted as flexibility rather than resignation. Her friend Priya had noticed the change first, weeks earlier, over coffee during their lunch break. "You used to talk about Daniel constantly," Priya had said, stirring sugar into her cup with more focus than the task required. "Now you barely mention him unless I ask." Amara had laughed it off at the time, claiming they were simply settled into a comfortable rhythm, the kind of quiet stability that came after years of marriage. But the comment had lodged itself somewhere in her mind, returning at odd moments, like now, as she stood alone in her kitchen slicing carrots for a dinner her husband might not eat until it had gone cold. She finished cooking and set 2 plates on the table, out of habit more than expectation. She ate alone, scrolling through her phone, glancing occasionally at the door. At 8:30, headlights swept briefly across the kitchen window, and she felt that familiar flutter of hope rise in her chest before she could stop it. Daniel came in, looking exhausted, his tie loosened, his shoulders slightly slumped. Sorry, he said, dropping his bag by the door. The Hartley account is a nightmare right now. I swear I'll make it up to you this weekend. It's fine, Amara said, and meant it less each time she said it. There's a plate in the fridge if you're hungry. He kissed her forehead absently, already scrolling through messages on his phone, and disappeared toward the kitchen. She sat at the table a moment longer, listening to the microwave hum in the next room, the small domestic sounds of a marriage running on autopilot. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Amara tried once more to bridge the growing distance between them. Can we talk? She asked softly, turning toward him in the dark. Of course, he said, though his voice carried the flat tone of someone already halfway toward sleep. What's wrong? I feel like we barely see each other anymore, she said carefully, choosing her words the way she always did now, gentle enough not to sound like an accusation, honest enough to mean something. I miss you, Daniel. I miss us. He shifted closer, wrapping an arm around her, murmuring reassurances into the darkness. I love you, you know that. Work has just been crazy lately. Once this project wraps up, things will slow down, I promise. She wanted so badly to believe him. She always wanted to believe him. But she had heard some version of this promise dozens of times over the past 2 years, each time attached to a different project, a different deadline, a different reason why things would get better soon but never quite did. You always say that, she said quietly, testing the words, watching for his reaction. I mean it this time, he said, already drifting toward sleep, his voice growing thinner with each word. She lay awake, long after his breathing had evened out, staring at the ceiling, feeling the familiar ache of being loved in words, but not in actions. She thought about her sister Naomi's recent visit, how Naomi's husband Elias had surprised her with flowers for no particular reason, how he had rearranged an entire weekend just to take Naomi hiking because she had mentioned missing the mountains. She thought about how foreign that kind of spontaneous affection had started to feel in her own life. The following weeks passed in a similar rhythm. Amara planned small surprises for Daniel, hoping to reignite something between them, hoping that if she showed enough love, enough patience, enough effort, he would eventually mirror it back to her. She planned a picnic one Saturday, packing sandwiches and fruit into a basket, only for Daniel to cancel an hour before, apologetic but firm, claiming an unexpected client call could not wait. She wrote him small notes and left them in his coat pockets, sweet reminders of affection meant to surprise him during his workday. He would text back a heart emoji, sometimes a brief thank you, but nothing ever followed. No note left in return, no small gesture reciprocated. Just the quiet acknowledgement of receiving love without the instinct to offer any back. One evening, after another canceled dinner plan, Amara sat on the back porch alone, watching the sky darken from orange to deep blue. She thought about all the effort she had poured into keeping their marriage warm, all the initiative she had taken to plan dates, start conversations, express affection, while Daniel simply existed alongside her, responding when convenient, absent when not. She was startled by her phone buzzing beside her. It was Naomi. Hey, Naomi said when Amara picked up. You sound tired. Everything okay? Amara hesitated before answering, unsure how much to share. I don't know, she admitted finally. I feel like I'm the only one trying anymore. Like I'm holding this whole marriage together by myself. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Have you told him that? I've tried, Amara said. He always says he'll change, that things will get better, but nothing ever actually changes. Maybe it's not about him changing, Naomi said gently. Maybe it's about you deciding how much longer you're willing to wait. The words settled uncomfortably in Amara's chest, too close to thoughts she had been avoiding examining too closely. She changed the subject quickly, steering the conversation toward lighter topics, though Naomi's words lingered in her mind long after the call ended. That weekend, Daniel surprised her by staying home, suggesting they finally take the picnic they had missed weeks earlier. Amara felt a small spark of hope rekindle inside her as they packed the basket together, driving out to the same quiet spot by the lake she had originally planned. For a few hours, things felt almost like they used to. Daniel laughed at her jokes, reached for her hand as they walked along the shoreline, seemed present in a way he had not been in months. Amara allowed herself to relax into the moment, allowed herself to believe, just briefly, that maybe things really were shifting. But halfway through their picnic, Daniel's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at it, hesitated only a moment, then answered, his voice shifting immediately into work mode. Amara sat quietly, picking at the grass beside her, watching him pace a few steps away, deeply engaged in a conversation about quarterly projections, while their picnic blanket sat forgotten behind him. When he finally returned, apologetic, promising it was urgent and would not happen again, Amara simply nodded, packing away the uneaten sandwiches, feeling that familiar disappointment settle over her once more. Quieter now, less sharp than it used to be, as though her body had begun adjusting to a lower baseline of expectation. Driving home that evening, Daniel reached for her hand across the console, oblivious to the quiet shift happening inside her. "That was really nice today," he said, smiling. "We should do that more often." "Yeah," Amara said softly, staring out the window at the passing trees. "We should." But even as she said it, she understood, somewhere deep and unspoken, that the words carried less hope than they once would have. She was tired, not of loving Daniel, but of loving him louder than he loved her back, of initiating warmth into a space that rarely returned it with equal measure. That night, after Daniel fell asleep beside her, Amara lay awake once more, staring at the dark ceiling, replaying the day's small disappointment against the earlier joy of their picnic. She thought about her sister's words, about deciding how much longer she was willing to wait, and she realized, with a quiet, unsettling clarity, that the question was no longer whether Daniel would change. The question was whether she still wanted to keep hoping he would. She did not have an answer yet, but for the first time, she allowed herself to admit the question existed at all, sitting with it in the darkness, feeling its weight settle gently, but permanently, into the space where blind hope used to live. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, and somewhere far away, an owl called out into the night, patient and unhurried, needing nothing from anyone to justify its presence in the world. Amara closed her eyes, wishing, just for a moment, that she could feel that same quiet self-sufficiency, untangled from the exhausting rhythm of waiting for someone else to decide she was worth showing up for. Sleep came slowly that night, but when it finally arrived, it carried with it the faint outline of a decision Amara had not yet made consciously, but had already begun, somewhere deep inside, to accept as inevitable. The wine glass shattered against the kitchen floor before Amara even realized her hand had let go of it. She stared down at the shards scattered across the tile, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. She had not meant to drop it. Her hands had simply stopped cooperating the moment Daniel said the words that now hung in the air between them. "I forgot to tell you, I have to fly out to Denver next week. The Hartley account needs someone on site." It was their anniversary week. 6 years married, and Daniel had just announced, almost as an afterthought while loosening his tie by the door, that he would be gone for the entire week surrounding the one date she had specifically asked him, weeks earlier, to keep clear. "Daniel," she said carefully, crouching to pick up the broken glass, buying herself time to steady her voice before speaking again. "That's our anniversary." He paused, genuine confusion crossing his face, as though the date existed somewhere in his mind, but had simply failed to connect itself to any real significance. "Oh no," he said slowly. "Amara, I'm so sorry. I completely lost track. This trip got scheduled so fast, I didn't even think to check the calendar." She swept the last of the glass into a dustpan, dumping it carefully into the trash, using the small mechanical task to keep her hands and mind occupied, instead of collapsing into the frustration building steadily inside her chest. "You never think to check the calendar," she said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes. "Not for this kind of thing." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable, though whether from guilt or simple annoyance at being confronted, Amara could no longer easily tell. "I know I've been distracted lately. Work has been insane, you know that. But this trip is important, Amara. If I land this account, it could mean a promotion. It could mean everything stabilizes for us financially. Everything already feels stable, she said, finally looking up at him. What's not stable is us. The words hung heavily in the kitchen, more direct than anything she had allowed herself to say in months. Daniel looked genuinely startled, as though the thought had never fully occurred to him that their marriage might be suffering beneath the surface of their otherwise ordinary, functional life. What do you mean? He asked, his voice softer now, carrying something closer to real concern. Amara took a deep breath, steadying herself before continuing. I mean, I feel alone, Daniel. I feel like I'm the only one keeping this marriage alive. I plan the dates. I remember the important days. I initiate every conversation about how we're doing. And you just exist alongside me, responding when it's convenient, forgetting when it's not. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing her words with visible discomfort. I didn't realize you felt that way, he said finally. I thought we were doing okay. I love you, Amara. You know that. I know you love me, she said, her voice trembling slightly, despite her effort to remain calm. But loving someone and showing up for them are not always the same thing. He stepped closer, reaching for her hands, his expression earnest. Let me fix this. I'll push the trip back. I'll tell them I need another week. Will you actually do that? She asked, searching his face for sincerity. Or will you say that now and then, call me from the airport apologizing because it was too complicated to change? The question landed harder than she intended, but she did not take it back. She was tired of soft accusations wrapped in gentle language that let him off easily. She wanted, for once, to see whether direct honesty could move him in a way that quiet patience never had. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, though he did not raise his voice. That's not fair, Amara. I'm trying. Are you? She asked. Because from where I'm standing, it feels like I'm the only one trying. They stood in silence for a long moment, the kitchen suddenly feeling very small around them. Finally, Daniel exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Okay, he said. Let me see what I can do about the trip. I really will try, Amara. I promise. She nodded, though the promise landed with far less weight than it once might have. She had heard so many promises over the past year that they had begun to blur together in her mind, indistinguishable from one another, each one carrying the same hollow shape. 2 days later, Daniel left for Denver anyway. The trip could not be pushed back, he explained apologetically over breakfast. The client had insisted on specific dates, and Daniel's manager had made it clear how important this account was for the company. He promised to call every night, promised to make it up to her the moment he returned, promised their anniversary would simply be celebrated a week late instead of on time. Amara nodded along to each promise, packing his suitcase for him out of habit, smoothing his shirts carefully, despite the quiet ache building behind her ribs. She drove him to the airport, kissed him goodbye at the curb, and watched him disappear through the sliding glass doors without looking back. The week that followed felt strange in its quiet emptiness. Amara went through her usual routines, work, groceries, evening walks around the neighborhood, but everything carried an unfamiliar hollowness, as though she were moving through the motions of her life without fully inhabiting them. On their actual anniversary, she stayed home alone, ordering food she did not really feel like eating, staring at old photographs on her phone from their wedding day. She scrolled slowly through images of herself in a white dress, laughing beside a man who used to look at her like she was the only person in the room. She wondered, not for the first time, where exactly that man had gone, and whether he still existed somewhere beneath the distracted, apologetic version currently standing in for him. Daniel called that night, as promised, his voice tired from a long day of meetings. "Happy anniversary," he said softly. "I'm sorry I'm not there. I miss you." "I miss you too," Amara said, and meant it, though the missing had started to feel less like longing for him specifically, and more like grief, for something that used to exist between them, and had quietly slipped away somewhere along the road. "We'll celebrate properly when I get back," he said. "I promise." "Sure," she said, the words slipping out automatically now, worn smooth from overuse. After the call ended, Amara sat alone in the quiet living room, staring at the framed wedding photograph on the mantel. She thought about the woman in that photograph, so certain of the future stretching ahead of her, so confident that love, once given fully, would always be returned in equal measure. She realized, sitting there in the dim evening light, that somewhere over the past several years, she had slowly stopped being that certain, hopeful woman. She had become someone who planned dates that got canceled, remembered anniversaries that got forgotten, and initiated conversations that resulted in promises rarely kept. She had become the architect of a marriage that only one of them seemed interested in maintaining. When Daniel returned from Denver a week later, he arrived home with a bouquet of flowers and reservations at a nice restaurant, determined to make up for the missed anniversary exactly as he had promised. Amara dressed carefully, put on the earrings he had given her years earlier, and joined him for dinner, allowing herself to enjoy the evening despite the quiet distance still lingering somewhere beneath her polite smiles. The dinner was pleasant enough. Daniel was attentive, funny, present in a way he had not been in months. For a few hours, Amara allowed herself to believe, once again, that perhaps this shift marked a genuine turning point, that perhaps her honesty in the kitchen days earlier had finally reached him, in a way that years of gentle patience never had. But as they drove home that night, Daniel's phone buzzed with a work email, and without thinking, he pulled the car over briefly to respond, apologizing quickly before continuing the drive. It was a small moment, barely noticeable in isolation, but it landed heavily in Amara's chest, confirming something she had already begun to suspect. The dinner, the flowers, the attentive evening, had been a gesture, not a genuine transformation. Daniel had responded to her honesty with effort, temporarily, the way people respond to almost losing something valuable. But the underlying pattern remained unchanged beneath the surface, waiting to resume its familiar shape the moment the immediate threat had passed. That night, lying beside Daniel as he slept peacefully, satisfied that their anniversary crisis had been successfully resolved, Amara stared at the ceiling once more, feeling the familiar weight of disappointment settle over her. Quieter now, more resigned than surprised. She thought about her sister's words from weeks earlier, about deciding how much longer she was willing to wait. She thought about the woman in the wedding photograph, so certain and hopeful, and wondered how much longer that woman could survive inside her, before finally, completely, disappearing altogether. She did not cry that night. She simply lay awake, feeling something inside her settle further into a quiet, unspoken decision. One she still was not ready to name out loud, but one that had already begun, slowly and steadily, to take root. The coffee shop buzzed with quiet conversation as Amara sat across from her friend Priya, both hands wrapped around a warm mug she had not yet touched. She had asked for this meeting on a whim, texting Priya during her lunch break with a simple message that read, "Can we talk today? I need to get out of my head." "You look exhausted," Priya said gently, studying Amara's face with the kind of careful attention only close friends offer. "I feel exhausted," Amara admitted. "Not physically, just tired, in a way sleep doesn't fix." Priya nodded slowly, waiting for her to continue, not pushing, simply making space for whatever needed to come out. "I keep trying," Amara said finally, staring down at her coffee. "I plan things. I remember things. I show up for this marriage every single day. And Daniel just floats along beside me, appearing when it's convenient, disappearing when work calls, and somehow expecting that his occasional grand gesture makes up for months of absence." "Have you told him this directly?" Priya asked. "Not gently, not carefully worded, just directly." "I tried," Amara said. "A few weeks ago, actually. I told him I felt alone in our marriage, that I felt like I was the only one trying. And what did he say? He apologized. He promised to change. He even canceled a work trip for me, sort of, though it ended up not actually happening, because the client insisted on specific dates." Amara laughed softly, without much humor behind it. "And then 2 days later, he took a work call in the middle of our anniversary dinner drive home." Priya raised an eyebrow. "So nothing actually changed?" "Nothing actually changed," Amara confirmed. "The apology changed. The promise changed, but the pattern stayed exactly the same underneath it." They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the coffee shop filling the space between them, distant laughter from another table, the hiss of the espresso machine, soft music playing overhead. "Can I ask you something honestly?" Priya said finally. Amara nodded, bracing herself slightly for whatever difficult question might follow. "What are you actually waiting for?" Priya asked. Like, specifically, what would need to happen for you to feel like things had genuinely changed? Amara opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, genuinely uncertain how to respond. She had never actually articulated a clear picture of what change would look like. She had simply been waiting, vaguely, for Daniel to somehow become more present, more attentive, more like the man he used to be, without ever defining exactly what that transformation would require, or how she would recognize it if it arrived. I don't know, she admitted slowly. I think I've just been hoping he'll eventually notice how much I'm doing and start matching it, without me having to spell it out constantly. Priya reached across the table, placing a hand gently over Amara's. Amara, you've been spelling it out. You told him directly, in the kitchen, exactly how you felt. He heard you. And within days, the pattern returned. That's not you failing to communicate clearly enough. That's him choosing, consciously or not, to stay comfortable in the version of this marriage that requires the least effort from him. The words landed heavily, uncomfortably true, in a way Amara had been avoiding examining too closely. She had spent months, maybe years, convinced that if she just tried harder, communicated more clearly, expressed her needs more gently, Daniel would eventually understand and change. But sitting here now, hearing Priya's blunt observation, she recognized the quiet unfairness in that framework. She had been carrying the entire emotional labor of their marriage, including the labor of teaching her own husband how to love her properly. I don't know what to do, Amara said quietly, her voice thinner now, more vulnerable than she usually allowed herself to sound outside her own home. You don't have to know right now, Priya said gently, but maybe start by asking yourself what you actually need, separate from what you think you should accept. Not what's reasonable given his job, not what's fair, given how busy he is. Just what you, Amara, specifically need to feel loved and valued. Amara sat with the question for a long moment, staring out the coffee shop window at the busy street beyond, people moving briskly past on their lunch breaks, unaware of the quiet unraveling happening at this small corner table. I need someone who remembers me without being reminded, she said slowly, the words emerging almost involuntarily, as though they had been waiting patiently inside her for the right moment to surface. I need someone who shows up because he wants to, not because I called him out for not showing up. I need to stop being the only one holding this marriage together. Priya smiled softly, something like quiet pride crossing her expression. That's a good start. They talked for another hour, moving through lighter topics eventually. Work gossip, weekend plans, a new restaurant Priya wanted to try. But as Amara drove back to the office afterward, Priya's earlier question lingered persistently in her mind. What are you actually waiting for? She realized, turning the question over carefully, that she had spent so long focused on managing Daniel's behavior, adjusting her expectations downward to match his diminishing effort, that she had lost track of her own needs almost entirely. She had become an expert in accommodation, in patience, in quietly absorbing disappointment without complaint. But somewhere along the way, she had stopped asking herself what she actually deserved. That evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual, cheerful from a successful client call. He kissed her on the cheek, mentioned offhandedly that dinner smelled good, and settled onto the couch to check his phone before dinner was ready. Amara watched him from the kitchen doorway, studying the familiar scene with new eyes. He looked comfortable, settled, confident that their marriage existed in a stable, functioning state, requiring nothing urgent from him beyond occasional apologies and promises whenever she raised concerns. He had no idea, she realized, watching him scroll casually through his phone, how close she had come, quietly and internally, to deciding she could not continue indefinitely in this pattern. Dinner's ready, she called, and he came to the table, chatting easily about his day, oblivious to the quiet shift happening inside her. Over the following days, Amara began paying closer attention to the small moments throughout her marriage, cataloging them carefully in her mind. She noticed how often she initiated physical affection, reaching for his hand, wrapping her arms around him while he cooked, and how rarely he initiated it in return. She noticed how she remembered his preferences, his coffee order, his favorite meals, his mother's birthday, while he frequently forgot even significant dates in her own life. She noticed, too, how tired she felt most evenings, not from her job, which she generally enjoyed, but from the constant low-level effort of managing their emotional connection almost entirely by herself. One evening, as they lay in bed together, Daniel reached for her, his hand finding hers beneath the blanket. "You've seemed quiet lately," he said softly. "Everything okay?" Amara considered her answer carefully before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot," she said finally. "About us, about what I need." "What do you need?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice, though Amara noticed, not for the first time, that the question came from him, only when she had already begun withdrawing slightly, rather than arising naturally from his own initiative. "I need you to remember me without me having to remind you constantly," she said. "I need you to show up because you want to, not because I've pointed out that you haven't been." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "I hear you," he said finally. "I'll work on it." She nodded, though something inside her recognized the familiar shape of this conversation. Another promise. Another moment of temporary attentiveness likely to fade once immediate concern passed. She did not argue or push further. She simply lay quietly beside him, feeling the weight of Priya's question settle more permanently into her mind. "What are you actually waiting for?" She still did not have a complete answer, but she understood, more clearly now than she had in a very long time, that the waiting itself, patient and endless, was slowly costing her something valuable, something she was not certain she could afford to keep losing indefinitely. As Daniel drifted off to sleep beside her, his breathing slow and even, Amara stared into the darkness, feeling a quiet, unfamiliar strength beginning to take shape somewhere deep inside her chest, small and fragile, but undeniably present. She did not know yet what she would do with that strength, but for the first time in a very long while, she recognized it as something worth protecting, rather than quietly setting aside in favor of someone else's comfort. Rain tapped softly against the office window, as Amara stared at a spreadsheet she had not actually read in nearly 10 minutes. Her mind kept drifting elsewhere, back to a conversation from the previous night, one that had settled into her thoughts and refused to leave. She had come home late from a work event, tired but energized, having led a successful presentation earlier that day. Daniel had been sitting at the kitchen table when she arrived, and instead of asking about her presentation, he had launched immediately into a detailed account of his own difficult day, barely pausing to acknowledge her achievement before moving into his own concerns. It was such a small moment, ordinary even, but it had stayed with her overnight. Another quiet data point in a pattern she had begun cataloging more consciously since her conversation with Priya weeks earlier. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her attention back to the present. It was a message from Naomi. "Coffee this weekend? I have something I want to talk to you about." Amara typed back a quick yes, grateful for the distraction, though she found herself wondering what Naomi wanted to discuss. Her sister rarely asked for dedicated time to talk about something specific, unless it mattered. Saturday morning arrived gray and quiet, rain still falling steadily outside, as Amara sat across from Naomi in a small cafe they had frequented since childhood, back when their mother used to bring them here for hot chocolate after Sunday church. "So," Amara said, wrapping her hands around a warm mug, "what's on your mind?" Naomi hesitated, stirring her coffee slowly before speaking. "I've been worried about you," she said finally. "For a while now, actually." Amara felt a small knot form in her stomach. "Worried how?" "You used to light up when you talked about Daniel," Naomi said gently. "Even small things, like what he made for dinner or some silly joke he told. Now you barely mention him unless I specifically ask. And even then, it's mostly about logistics, his schedule, his work trips. Never anything that sounds like joy." Amara opened her mouth to defend herself automatically, then stopped, recognizing the same protective instinct she had felt during her conversation with Priya weeks earlier. "I've been trying to figure out what's actually true," she said slowly, "underneath the excuses I keep making for both of us." "And what have you figured out?" Naomi asked, her voice soft but steady. Amara took a deep breath before answering. "I think I've been carrying our marriage almost entirely by myself for a long time now. I plan everything. I remember everything. I initiate every difficult conversation, and Daniel just responds when it's convenient, and forgets when it isn't." Naomi nodded slowly, unsurprised, as though confirming something she had already suspected. "Elias and I have been together 7 years, she said, "and I won't pretend our marriage is perfect, but I remember, early on, deciding that I would never carry the entire emotional weight of our relationship alone. If I felt myself doing that, even a little, I would say something immediately, not months or years later. I've said things, Amara said, a note of defensiveness creeping into her voice despite herself. I told him directly, a few weeks ago, exactly how I felt. And he apologized, promised to change. For a few days, things felt different. Then they slowly went back to normal. Naomi reached across the table, placing her hand gently over Amara's. Amara, I love you, and I'm not trying to tell you what to do, but I think you already know, somewhere inside yourself, that apologies without lasting change eventually stop meaning anything. The words settled heavily, uncomfortably true. Amara stared down at her coffee, watching small ripples form across its surface as her hand trembled slightly. I keep thinking maybe I'm expecting too much, she admitted quietly. Maybe everyone's marriage looks like this eventually. Maybe the passionate, attentive version of love only exists in the beginning, and what's left afterward is just this. Managing logistics. Coexisting. Is that what you want, though? Naomi asked. Just coexisting? Amara did not answer immediately, turning the question over slowly in her mind. She thought about her parents' marriage, quiet and stable, but rarely affectionate, and how she had once promised herself, as a teenager, that her own marriage would look different. She thought about the early years with Daniel, full of spontaneous laughter and easy affection, and how gradually, almost invisibly, that warmth had eroded into something closer to polite cohabitation. No, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. That's not what I want. Then maybe it's time to stop waiting for him to notice on his own, Naomi said gently, and start deciding, clearly, what you actually need moving forward. Not as an ultimatum necessarily, just as clarity, for yourself first, and then for him. They sat together quietly for a while after that, the rain outside softening gradually into a light drizzle, sunlight beginning to break faintly through the gray clouds. Amara felt something shifting inside her, not quite resolution yet, but the early outline of one, forming slowly like the shape of land becoming visible through fog. Driving home later that afternoon, Amara found herself replaying the conversation repeatedly, particularly Naomi's question about what she actually wanted. She realized, with a kind of quiet clarity she had not felt in a long time, that she wanted, simply, to be chosen. Not out of guilt or obligation or fear of losing her, but genuinely, actively chosen, the way she had chosen Daniel every single day, for years, without pause or hesitation. When she arrived home, Daniel was in the living room, absorbed in a work email on his laptop. He glanced up briefly as she entered. Hey, how was coffee with Naomi? Good, Amara said, setting her keys down carefully. We talked about a lot of things. Yeah, he said, already glancing back toward his screen, his attention only partially present in the conversation. Amara watched him for a long moment, studying the familiar shape of his distraction, the easy way his focus slipped elsewhere even during a simple exchange with her. She thought about Naomi's words, about deciding clearly what she needed, rather than waiting indefinitely for him to notice on his own. Daniel, she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter building in her chest. Can we talk properly? Not right now if you're busy, but sometime this week, when you can really focus? He looked up again, something in her tone apparently catching his attention more fully this time. Of course, he said, closing his laptop slightly. Is everything okay? I think we need to have an honest conversation, she said carefully, about where things actually stand between us. Daniel studied her face for a long moment, something like genuine concern flickering behind his eyes. Okay, he said finally, let's talk tonight, after dinner. I promise I'll be fully present. Amara nodded, though she recognized, with a kind of weary familiarity, the shape of another promise being made. Still, something felt different this time, not in his words necessarily, but in her own resolve. She was no longer simply hoping he would notice her unhappiness and spontaneously change. She was preparing, deliberately and clearly, to name exactly what she needed, and to pay close attention to whether his response would finally match the seriousness of the moment. That evening, after dinner, they sat together on the living room couch, the television off, phones set aside on the coffee table. Amara took a deep breath, gathering the clarity she had found earlier that day with Naomi, and began speaking honestly, without softening her words the way she usually did to protect his feelings. She told him about the accumulated weight of forgotten birthdays and canceled plans, about the exhausting imbalance of remembering versus being remembered, about the quiet loneliness of carrying their marriage's emotional labor almost entirely alone. She told him, finally, that she needed to see consistent change, not another isolated apology followed by temporary effort. Daniel listened quietly throughout, his expression shifting slowly from mild defensiveness into something closer to genuine reflection. When she finished speaking, he was silent for a long moment, processing everything she had said. "I didn't realize how deeply this had been affecting you," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "I think I've been telling myself that because I love you, that's enough, without really examining whether my actions actually show that love consistently." Amara felt something loosen slightly in her chest, cautious hope stirring despite her efforts to remain guarded. "I need actions, Daniel," she said gently. "Not just love in theory. Love that shows up, remembers, initiates. Love that doesn't require me to point it out every time it's missing." "I hear you," he said, reaching for her hand. "I want to do better. I really do." She squeezed his hand gently, allowing herself a small measure of hope, though she noticed, even as she did, a quiet awareness settling permanently into her mind. She would watch closely now, not with suspicion exactly, but with clear-eyed attention, ready to recognize whether his words translated into lasting change or simply repeated the familiar pattern of temporary effort, fading gradually back into old habits. For the first time in months, she felt something like control returning to her own emotional life, not through anger or ultimatums, but through the quiet clarity of finally naming, fully and honestly, exactly what she needed to feel valued in her own marriage. Whatever happened next, she realized, lying beside Daniel later that night, would depend entirely on whether he could match that clarity with consistent action. And for the first time, she felt genuinely prepared, whatever the outcome, to honor what she now understood clearly as her own worth. 3 weeks passed after that honest conversation on the living room couch, and Amara noticed something curious happening inside herself, something she had not expected. Daniel had made small, genuine efforts, remembering to ask about her day, initiating a spontaneous dinner date, even surprising her with tickets to a play she had mentioned wanting to see months earlier. And yet, despite these gestures, Amara found herself responding with less enthusiasm than she once would have. She sat at her desk one afternoon, staring at the ticket confirmation email Daniel had forwarded her that morning, and realized, with quiet surprise, that she felt pleased but not desperate the way she once might have felt, grateful but not overwhelmed with relief the way gestures like this used to affect her. Something inside her had shifted, quietly and permanently, over the past several months of disappointment and honest reflection. She had stopped, somewhere along the way, building her entire emotional stability around Daniel's attention. She had begun, instead, redirecting some of that energy back toward herself. It started small. She signed up again for the pottery class she had abandoned years earlier, when Daniel's schedule made shared evenings unpredictable. She began meeting Priya for coffee more regularly, not just during difficult moments, but simply for enjoyment. She started reading again, finishing novels she had left half-completed for months, savoring quiet evenings with a book instead of waiting anxiously for Daniel to arrive home. Daniel noticed the pottery class first. "You've been going out a lot more lately," he mentioned one evening, not quite accusatory, but with a note of surprise in his voice. "I have," Amara said simply, continuing to fold laundry without elaborating further. "That's good," he said, though something uncertain flickered across his expression, as though he were recalibrating an assumption he had held for a long time without fully realizing it. She did not explain herself further, and he did not ask again immediately. But over the following weeks, Amara noticed him watching her more closely during these moments, observing her leave for pottery class with genuine enthusiasm, noticing her deep in a novel during evenings he used to assume she would spend simply waiting for him. One Saturday afternoon, she returned from a hike with Priya, her cheeks flushed from the fresh air and exercise, laughing about something Priya had said during their drive home. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table when she walked in, his expression difficult to read. "You seem happy," he said, an odd note in his voice, somewhere between curiosity and quiet unease. "I am happy," Amara said, setting her bag down and pouring herself a glass of water. It was a beautiful trail. We should go sometime. Actually, you'd probably like it. Yeah, he said, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than usual, studying her with an expression she could not quite place. She did not think much of the exchange at the time, continuing on with her evening, preparing dinner, chatting easily about her day. But similar moments accumulated gradually over the following weeks, small instances of Daniel watching her with quiet, unspoken curiosity, as though trying to understand a shift he could sense but not fully articulate. Amara, meanwhile, found herself experiencing something unfamiliar and quietly liberating. She no longer felt the constant undercurrent of anxious waiting she had carried for so long, the persistent internal monitoring of Daniel's moods, his schedule, his level of attentiveness on any given day. She still loved him, deeply and genuinely, but she no longer organized her entire emotional world around predicting and managing his presence or absence. She stopped initiating every single conversation about their relationship, no longer feeling the urgent need to constantly assess where they stood. She stopped planning elaborate surprises meant to reignite spontaneous romance, allowing herself instead to simply enjoy whatever affection arose naturally, without manufacturing it through her own relentless effort. Naomi noticed the change during their next coffee visit. "You seem different," she said, studying Amara carefully across the table. "Lighter, somehow." "I think I finally stopped waiting so hard," Amara admitted, smiling slightly at the realization, even as she spoke it aloud. "I'm still here. I still love him, but I've stopped making his attention the center of my entire happiness." "How does that feel?" Naomi asked. Honestly, Amara considered the question carefully. "It feels like breathing again, after holding my breath for a really long time without realizing it." Naomi smiled warmly, reaching across the table to squeeze her sister's hand. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. Meanwhile, at home, Daniel continued, noticing small shifts he could not fully explain. Amara no longer texted him constantly throughout the day, the way she once had. She no longer waited by the door each evening, anxious for his arrival. She no longer asked, every single night, how his day had gone, the way she used to, faithfully and consistently, regardless of whether he reciprocated the question. One evening, arriving home later than expected after another long workday, Daniel found Amara curled up on the couch, deeply absorbed in a novel, a cup of tea steaming gently on the side table beside her. She glanced up briefly as he entered, offered a warm but brief smile, and returned her attention to her book. "Hey," he said, hovering slightly near the doorway, an odd uncertainty in his posture. "Sorry I'm late again." "It's okay," Amara said simply, turning a page. "There's dinner in the fridge if you're hungry." He stood there a moment longer, seemingly waiting for something more, some familiar rhythm of concern or questioning he had grown accustomed to over the years. When it did not come, he nodded slowly and moved toward the kitchen, an unfamiliar quietness settling over the house that neither of them commented on directly. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Daniel turned toward her in the darkness. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly. "Of course," Amara replied, setting her phone down on the nightstand. "Do you still feel the way you did a few months ago, about feeling alone in our marriage?" Amara considered the question honestly before answering. "I don't feel alone anymore," she said finally. "But I think that's because I've stopped relying so heavily on you to fill every single emotional need I have. I've started building more of my own life again, separate from waiting for you." Daniel absorbed this quietly, something complicated crossing his expression in the dim light. "Is that a good thing?" he asked finally, an unfamiliar uncertainty in his voice. "I think it is," Amara said gently. "For me at least. I'm happier, calmer. I still love you, Daniel. But I've stopped organizing my entire life around waiting for you to show up." He was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this information with visible difficulty, as though recalibrating some deep assumption he had unconsciously held about the stability of their arrangement. "I want to be someone you don't have to build a separate life away from," he said finally, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable than she had heard in a long while. "Then show up," Amara said simply, without harshness, simply stating what felt, to her, like an obvious truth. "Not because I'm asking you to anymore, just because you want to." He reached for her hand in the darkness, and she allowed him to hold it, though something in her had changed permanently now. Something calm and steady that no longer depended entirely on his response. Whatever happened moving forward, she realized, drifting slowly toward sleep, she would be okay either way. A realization that felt, for the first time in a very long while, quietly and completely her own. Daniel sat at his office desk, staring at his computer screen without actually reading the report displayed on it. His mind kept drifting back to the previous night, to the strange, quiet conversation in the dark, to Amara's calm, steady voice, explaining that she no longer felt alone, precisely because she had stopped depending so heavily on him. He had told himself, in the weeks following their honest conversation on the living room couch, that he was doing better. He had remembered a few important dates, initiated a couple of dinner plans, made a genuine effort to be more present during their time together. He had assumed, comfortably, that these gestures were sufficient, that Amara's earlier unhappiness had been addressed and resolved. But something about last night's conversation unsettled him in a way he could not quite articulate. Amara had not sounded upset or accusatory. She had sounded, instead, calm and slightly distant, speaking about her own happiness as something increasingly separate from him, rather than something dependent on his attention. He shook his head, trying to refocus on the report in front of him, telling himself he was likely overanalyzing an ordinary conversation. Amara was probably just tired, he reasoned, or working through some temporary phase. Things would settle back into their familiar rhythm soon enough. Over the following weeks, Daniel continued operating under this assumption, gradually allowing his attention to drift back toward its usual focal point, his demanding job, his ambitious professional goals, the steady climb toward the promotion he had been working toward for over a year. He continued making occasional gestures toward Amara, remembering small things here and there, but slowly, almost without noticing, his effort began settling back into its previous comfortable pattern. He assumed, without examining the assumption too closely, that Amara would remain patiently present, the way she always had, waiting quietly in the background of his busy life, ready to welcome him back whenever his schedule finally allowed for more consistent attention. He did not notice, at first, the subtle shifts occurring gradually within their household. He did not notice that Amara had stopped asking, every single evening, how his day had gone. He did not notice that she no longer texted him small affectionate messages throughout the day, the way she used to, faithfully and consistently. He did not notice that she had begun scheduling her own plans, her pottery class, her hikes with Priya, her coffee visits with Naomi, without checking first whether these activities might conflict with potential evenings together. One Friday evening, Daniel came home later than expected, having stayed late at the office finalizing details for the Hartley account presentation, scheduled for the following Monday. He walked into the house, anticipating the familiar scene of Amara waiting for him, perhaps slightly annoyed but ultimately understanding, ready to hear about his exhausting day and offer the quiet reassurance she always provided. Instead, he found the house empty, a note on the kitchen counter in Amara's familiar handwriting. "Gone to dinner with Priya. There's leftovers in the fridge if you're hungry. Back around 10. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the note, an unfamiliar unease settling over him. This was not accusatory or dramatic. It was simply informative, practical, unbothered. And somehow, that neutrality unsettled him more deeply than an argument would have. He heated up leftovers and ate alone at the kitchen table, checking his phone periodically, half expecting a text from Amara checking in, asking how his presentation preparation was going, offering the familiar reassurance she always provided during stressful work periods. No message came. When she returned around 10, cheerful and relaxed from her evening with Priya, she greeted him warmly but briefly, mentioning she was tired and heading to bed early. Daniel sat alone in the living room afterward, staring at nothing in particular, an uncomfortable realization beginning to take shape slowly in his mind. He thought back over the past several weeks, piecing together small moments he had previously dismissed as insignificant. Amara, arriving home cheerful, from activities that did not involve him. Amara absorbed in her own hobbies during evenings he used to assume she would spend anxiously awaiting his return. Amara responding to his lateness with calm acceptance, rather than the familiar mixture of disappointment and quiet hope she used to display. He had assumed, comfortably and perhaps arrogantly, that her earlier unhappiness had simply faded once he made a few visible efforts toward change. But sitting alone in the quiet living room now, he began to suspect something more significant had actually occurred, something he had failed to recognize because it did not manifest as anger or confrontation, but as quiet, steady independence. The following Monday, Daniel successfully delivered his presentation, securing the Hartley account and receiving enthusiastic praise from his manager, along with strong indications that the long-awaited promotion would likely follow soon. He should have felt triumphant, the culmination of months of dedicated effort finally paying off. Instead, driving home that evening, he found himself replaying recent months with Amara, searching for reassurance that their marriage remained as stable and secure as he had always assumed. He arrived home to find Amara in the kitchen, laughing on the phone with Naomi about something clearly amusing, her posture relaxed and genuinely happy, in a way that struck him, suddenly, as slightly foreign. She glanced up, offered him a warm smile, mouthed congratulations silently upon noticing his triumphant expression, and continued her conversation without pausing to ask for details. He waited in the living room, expecting her to finish the call quickly, eager to hear about his successful presentation, to celebrate together the achievement he had been working toward for so long. But her conversation with Naomi continued for several more minutes, unhurried and clearly enjoyable, before she finally hung up and joined him. "Sorry about that," she said, settling onto the couch beside him. "How did the presentation go?" He told her, and she listened attentively, offering genuine congratulations, asking thoughtful questions about what this success might mean for his career moving forward. It was, in many ways, exactly the supportive conversation he had anticipated, and yet, something about the timing, about her relaxed willingness to finish her own conversation first, unsettled him in a way he could not quite dismiss. Later that night, lying awake beside her sleeping form, Daniel found himself confronting an uncomfortable realization, slowly taking shape in his mind. He had spent years assuming Amara's patient devotion existed as a permanent, unshakable feature of their marriage, something requiring little active maintenance on his part, because it would simply always be there, waiting faithfully regardless of how much attention he offered in return. But watching her recent behavior, her calm independence, her genuine happiness increasingly separate from his presence, he began to suspect, with a growing unease he could not fully ignore, that this assumption might have been dangerously mistaken. He thought about the conversation weeks earlier, her voice calm and steady, explaining that she no longer felt alone, precisely because she had stopped depending so heavily on him. At the time, he had interpreted this as reassurance, evidence that his earlier efforts had successfully addressed her concerns. Now, lying awake in the darkness, he began to wonder whether her words had actually meant something quite different, something closer to a warning he had failed, in his comfortable assumption, to properly recognize. He turned toward her sleeping form, studying her peaceful expression in the dim light filtering through the curtains. She looked content, settled, entirely at ease, in a way that no longer seemed to depend on anything he specifically provided. And for the first time in their 6 years of marriage, Daniel felt something unfamiliar stirring within him, a quiet, creeping fear that perhaps he had misunderstood something fundamental about his wife, something he was only now, belatedly, beginning to recognize before it might be too late to properly address. The realization arrived fully, undeniably, on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after Daniel's successful presentation. He had planned, for once without any external prompting, a surprise dinner for their upcoming anniversary, the same anniversary that had been overshadowed the previous year by his work trip to Denver. He had made reservations weeks in advance at the restaurant where they had celebrated their first date, arranged for flowers to be delivered to the house that morning, and left work early, genuinely excited to surprise Amara with an evening entirely dedicated to her. He arrived home carrying the flowers, his heart lighter than it had felt in months, anticipating her surprised, delighted reaction. Instead, he found the house quiet, a note waiting on the kitchen counter in her now familiar handwriting. Went out with Priya and some co-workers for drinks, celebrating her promotion. Might be late, don't wait up. There's leftovers if you're hungry. Daniel stood frozen in the kitchen, flowers still in hand, staring at the note with an expression of genuine shock. He checked his phone immediately, scrolling back through recent messages, searching for any mention of their anniversary, any acknowledgement from Amara about the significance of today's date. He found nothing. She had simply forgotten, Or perhaps, he realized with a growing unease, she had not forgotten at all, but had simply stopped prioritizing it the way she once faithfully had. He set the flowers down slowly on the counter, sitting heavily at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular, as the full weight of the moment settled over him. For years, Amara had been the one remembering every important date, planning every meaningful celebration, initiating every effort to keep their marriage feeling special and intentional. He had grown so accustomed to her faithful attentiveness that he had never once considered what it might feel like if that attentiveness simply disappeared. Now, sitting alone in the quiet kitchen on their anniversary, surrounded by flowers she had not yet noticed and reservations she apparently was not planning to attend, Daniel understood, finally and completely, the quiet ache Amara must have felt during all those years he had absent-mindedly forgotten her birthday, canceled their plans, prioritized his career above the small, consistent gestures that build genuine intimacy over time. He canceled the restaurant reservation quietly, apologizing to the confused host on the phone, and sat alone at the kitchen table for a long while, processing the uncomfortable clarity now settling firmly into his understanding. Amara had not simply moved on to a temporary phase of independence, as he had comfortably assumed weeks earlier. She had genuinely, deliberately, stopped waiting for him. Around 11 that night, Amara returned home, cheerful and slightly tipsy from celebrating Priya's promotion, laughing softly to herself as she hung her coat by the door. She noticed Daniel sitting quietly at the kitchen table, the flowers still resting untouched on the counter, and her expression shifted quickly into confusion. "What's all this?" she asked, gesturing toward the flowers. Daniel looked up at her, an unfamiliar vulnerability visible in his expression. "It's our anniversary," he said quietly. Amara's face shifted through several emotions quickly, confusion giving way to genuine surprise, and then, unmistakably, to embarrassment. "Oh no," she said, sitting down slowly across from him. "Daniel, I completely lost track. I'm so sorry." "It's okay," he said, though his voice carried something heavier than simple reassurance. "I think I finally understand something I should have understood a long time ago." Amara studied him carefully, sensing the unusual seriousness in his tone. "What do you mean?" Daniel took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "For years, you remembered everything. Every birthday, every anniversary, every small moment that mattered. And I let you carry that entirely by yourself, assuming you always would, without ever really considering what it cost you to do that." He paused, looking down at his hands before continuing. "Tonight, for the first time, I finally understand what it feels like when the person you love simply forgets. Not out of malice, but because they've stopped organizing their life around remembering you specifically." Amara was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words carefully. "I didn't forget on purpose," she said softly. "I've just been building a life that doesn't revolve entirely around waiting for you anymore." "I know," Daniel said, meeting her eyes directly. "And I think that's exactly what scares me. Because I finally understand, sitting here tonight, exactly how much you must have needed me to notice sooner." They sat together quietly for a long while after that, the flowers wilting slightly on the counter, the canceled reservation a small, symbolic reminder of an opportunity missed through years of accumulated neglect. Amara reached across the table eventually, taking Daniel's hand gently in her own. "I still love you," she said softly. "That hasn't changed. But I think something important has shifted inside me, permanently, and I'm not entirely sure how to explain it, beyond saying that I've simply stopped waiting anxiously for you to show up the way I used to." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the full weight of her honesty. "Is there a way back from that?" he asked quietly, genuine uncertainty in his voice. "Or has too much time already passed?" Amara considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "But I think if there is a way back, it starts with you understanding, really understanding, what tonight felt like for you, and choosing, consistently, moving forward, not to let me feel that way again." They talked late into the night, more honestly than they had in years, Daniel finally articulating, clearly and vulnerably, the fear now taking root inside him, the realization that he might have waited too long to recognize how deeply his neglect had reshaped their marriage. Amara listened carefully, offering honesty in return, neither softening her words to protect his feelings, nor exaggerating them for dramatic effect. simply speaking plainly about where things genuinely stood between them. As the conversation wound down near midnight, Daniel reached for her hand once more. "I want to earn back the version of us that existed before I got so lost in my own ambitions," he said quietly. "Not through one grand gesture, but through consistent, everyday effort, the same way you showed up for me for so many years." Amara squeezed his hand gently, though her expression remained carefully measured, neither fully hopeful nor entirely resigned. "That would mean a lot," she said honestly. "But I need you to understand, Daniel, that I'm not going back to waiting anxiously the way I used to. I've built a life now that feels genuinely mine, separate from you. If you want to be part of that life moving forward, you'll need to actively choose to join it, consistently, not just during moments of crisis like tonight." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the clarity of her words, understanding, finally and completely, that whatever happened next would depend entirely on his ability to translate this painful realization into sustained, meaningful action, rather than another temporary gesture, destined to fade once the immediate discomfort passed. As they finally headed toward bed that night, the wilted flowers still sitting on the kitchen counter, Daniel felt something shift permanently inside himself, a quiet, uncomfortable understanding that the version of their marriage he had comfortably assumed would always remain waiting for him had genuinely, irreversibly changed. Whatever came next between them would require something he had never truly offered before: consistent, deliberate effort, freely given, rather than assumed as guaranteed. The weeks following their anniversary conversation brought a noticeable shift in Daniel's behavior, one that Amara observed carefully, with the same clear-eyed attention she had been cultivating for months. He began leaving work earlier, not occasionally, but consistently, arriving home in time for dinner most evenings. He started asking about her day before launching into his own concerns, listening attentively rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. He remembered small things too: the name of a difficult coworker she had mentioned only once, the specific date of an upcoming pottery exhibition she had been looking forward to, her preference for a particular type of tea during stressful weeks. These small gestures accumulated gradually, forming a pattern noticeably different from the isolated grand gestures he had offered in the past. One evening, arriving home from her pottery class, Amara found Daniel in the kitchen, attempting to recreate a recipe she had mentioned loving during a recent dinner out. The kitchen was slightly chaotic, flour dusting the counter, a pot bubbling over slightly on the stove, but the effort itself struck her as genuinely significant. "What's all this?" she asked, smiling despite herself at the sight of him wrestling with an unfamiliar recipe. "I wanted to surprise you," he said, looking up from the stove, slightly flustered, but clearly pleased with himself. "It's not going exactly as planned, but I'm determined to finish it." She laughed, genuinely amused, and joined him at the counter, helping guide him through the trickier steps of the recipe. They cooked together that evening, laughing over minor mistakes, falling into an easy rhythm that reminded her, faintly, of their early years together, before work schedules and accumulated disappointments had gradually eroded their spontaneous connection. Yet even as these positive moments accumulated, Amara noticed herself remaining carefully guarded, unwilling to fully release the quiet independence she had built over the past several months. She continued attending her pottery class regularly, maintained her coffee visits with Naomi, and hiking trips with Priya, and resisted the urge to immediately reorganize her entire schedule around Daniel's renewed attentiveness. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel suggested they attend a weekend workshop together, something new they could experience jointly, rather than Amara simply pursuing her own hobbies separately. She agreed, cautiously optimistic, and they spent the day learning basic woodworking together, laughing over their shared clumsiness with unfamiliar tools, building a small wooden box neither of them had expected to actually complete successfully. Driving home afterward, Daniel reached for her hand across the console, an easy, natural gesture that felt different somehow from the deliberate effort of his earlier attempts at reconnection. "That was really fun," he said, smiling genuinely. "I'd like to do more things like that together, if you're open to it." "I'd like that too," Amara said honestly, meaning it more fully than she had expected to. Over the following months, their marriage settled into a new, more balanced rhythm, one built gradually, through consistent small efforts, rather than dramatic gestures, meant to compensate for extended periods of neglect. Daniel continued prioritizing time together, not perfectly, occasionally slipping back into old patterns during particularly demanding work periods, but consistently enough that Amara began, cautiously, to trust the change as genuine rather than temporary. She noticed, too, subtle shifts in her own feelings, a gradual softening of the guarded independence she had built as protection against continued disappointment. She still maintained her own separate life, her hobbies, her friendships, her individual sense of self-worth, no longer entirely dependent on Daniel's attention. But she found herself, increasingly, choosing to include him in that life, rather than deliberately maintaining distance. One evening, several months after their difficult anniversary conversation, Naomi visited for dinner, observing the easy warmth between Amara and Daniel throughout the evening, with quiet curiosity. After Daniel excused himself briefly to take a work call, Naomi turned to her sister with genuine interest. "Things seem really different," she observed. "Better, I mean." Amara considered the observation carefully before responding. "They are different," she agreed. "But I think what's changed most isn't really about Daniel specifically. It's about how I approach our marriage now." "What do you mean?" Naomi asked. "I used to build my entire happiness around whether Daniel showed up the way I hoped he would," Amara explained. "Now, I've built a life that feels genuinely mine, separate from him. When he shows up now, I appreciate it, genuinely. But I'm not desperate for it the way I used to be, and strangely, that's made all the difference." Naomi smiled warmly, squeezing her sister's hand. "I'm really proud of you," she said sincerely. "Whatever happens moving forward, you found your way back to yourself first. That matters, regardless of how things unfold with Daniel." Daniel returned from his call a few minutes later, apologizing for the interruption, and the conversation shifted naturally toward lighter topics for the remainder of the evening. But Naomi's words lingered in Amara's mind long after her sister had left, a quiet affirmation of the journey she had traveled over the past year. That night, as she and Daniel prepared for bed, he paused, studying her thoughtfully in the dim bedroom light. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course," she replied. "Do you think we're actually going to be okay?" he asked, genuine vulnerability visible in his expression. Not just functioning, but genuinely okay. Amara considered the question honestly before answering. "I think we have a real chance," she said finally. "But only because you've shown me, consistently, over these past several months, that the change is genuine, rather than temporary. If you had simply made a few gestures and slipped back into old patterns, I don't think we'd be having this conversation right now." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing her honesty. "I understand that now," he said quietly. "I spent years assuming you would always be there, patiently waiting, no matter how little effort I offered in return. I don't take that assumption for granted anymore." "Good," Amara said simply, though warmth colored her tone, despite the directness of her words. "Because I'm not the same person who waited quietly for years, hoping you'd eventually notice. I've found my own strength now, separate from you. If we're going to build something lasting together, it needs to be a genuine partnership, not me carrying the emotional weight alone, while you simply benefit from my effort." "Agreed," Daniel said, reaching for her hand. "Completely agreed." They settled into bed together that night, the quiet comfort between them, feeling genuinely earned rather than simply assumed, built gradually, through months of consistent effort rather than a single dramatic turning point. Amara drifted toward sleep feeling, for the first time in a very long while, a stable sense of peace, not because Daniel had finally changed, though he had, but because she had finally learned to build her own happiness, on a foundation that no longer depended entirely on someone else's inconsistent attention. Whatever the future held, she understood now, she would face it from a place of genuine strength rather than anxious hope, a strength she had discovered slowly, painfully, and ultimately, entirely on her own. A full year passed after that difficult anniversary conversation, and Amara found herself standing once again in the same small chapel garden where she and Daniel had exchanged their wedding vows 7 years earlier, though this time, the occasion was entirely different. Naomi was getting married, and Amara stood beside her sister as maid of honor, watching the late afternoon sunlight filter softly through the surrounding trees. Daniel sat among the guests, watching the ceremony with quiet attentiveness, occasionally catching Amara's eye and offering a warm, genuine smile. She found herself smiling back easily, without the careful guardedness that had once colored so many of their interactions. The past year had not been without its challenges. There had been moments when old patterns threatened to resurface, evenings when Daniel's work demanded more than usual, and Amara felt the familiar flicker of old disappointment stirring within her. But each time, they had returned to the honesty they had cultivated during that difficult anniversary conversation, addressing concerns directly, rather than allowing them to accumulate silently into resentment. Daniel had continued making consistent, genuine effort, not perfect, but sustained enough that Amara had gradually allowed herself to trust the change as real. He remembered important dates now without needing reminders. He initiated plans regularly, rather than simply responding to Amara's efforts. He asked about her days with genuine curiosity, listening fully, rather than waiting distractedly for his turn to speak. More importantly, Amara had maintained the independent life she had built during their difficult period, continuing her pottery classes, her hiking trips with Priya, her regular coffee visits with Naomi. She no longer measured her own happiness entirely by Daniel's attentiveness, though she welcomed and appreciated it more genuinely now, precisely because it no longer felt like her only source of emotional stability. After the ceremony concluded, guests gathered for the reception in a nearby garden, string lights beginning to glow softly as evening approached. Amara found Daniel near the edge of the gathering, watching the celebration with a thoughtful expression. "Beautiful ceremony," he said, as she approached. "It really was," Amara agreed, standing beside him, watching Naomi and Elias share their first dance as a married couple, laughing together with easy joy. "It made me think about us," Daniel said quietly, still watching the dancing couple. "About how far we've come this past year." Amara turned to look at him, studying his thoughtful expression. "It has been a journey," she agreed. "I used to assume our marriage would simply take care of itself," Daniel said, turning to meet her eyes directly. "That because I loved you, that love alone was enough, regardless of whether I actually showed up consistently to demonstrate it. I understand now how wrong that assumption was." "You've shown me differently," Amara said gently, "consistently, for an entire year now." "I want to keep showing you," Daniel said, reaching for her hand. "Not because I'm afraid of losing you, though I am grateful every day that I didn't, but because I genuinely want to be someone worthy of the love you've given me, the same steady, consistent love you offered for years, before I finally understood how to properly return it." Amara squeezed his hand gently, warmth spreading through her chest at his words. "I still maintain my own life, Daniel," she said honestly, "separate from you. I think that's part of why this year has worked so well. I'm not waiting for you anymore. I'm choosing you, actively, every day, from a place of genuine strength, rather than desperate need." "I know," Daniel said, smiling softly. "And honestly, I think that's part of why I love you, even more deeply now than I did when we first married. You're not the same woman who waited quietly, hoping I'd eventually notice her. You're someone entirely secure in her own worth, who happens to choose me, deliberately, each and every day." They stood together quietly for a moment, watching the celebration unfold around them, the warm glow of string lights reflecting softly in the evening air. Naomi approached them eventually, flushed and joyful from her first dance, embracing her sister warmly. "Thank you for everything," Naomi said, tears of happiness glistening in her eyes. "For being here, for all your support these past few months while I planned everything." "Always," Amara said, hugging her sister tightly. "I'm so happy for you, Naomi. Truly." As the evening progressed, Amara found herself dancing with Daniel beneath the soft glow of the string lights, his hands steady on her waist, their movements easy and familiar, in a way that felt genuinely earned rather than simply assumed. She thought back, briefly, to that painful birthday over a year earlier, when she had lain awake beside him, quietly recognizing that she had stopped waiting for him to change. She had not known then where that quiet realization would eventually lead her. She had not anticipated the difficult months of honest conversation, the careful rebuilding of her own independent identity, the eventual, gradual transformation in Daniel's behavior once he finally understood, fully and painfully, the weight of what he had nearly lost. But standing here now, dancing beneath soft evening light at her sister's wedding, held gently by a husband who had genuinely learned to show up consistently, rather than simply assuming her patient love would always remain unconditionally available, Amara felt a quiet, complete sense of peace settle over her. She had stopped waiting for affection that never seemed to come, And in doing so, she had discovered her own strength, her own worth, her own capacity for genuine happiness, independent of anyone else's inconsistent attention. And through that discovery, she had inadvertently created space for Daniel to finally recognize, deeply and completely, the value of showing up consistently for the person he loved. As the music shifted into a slower song, Daniel pulled her slightly closer, resting his forehead gently against hers. "I love you," he whispered softly, "not just in words anymore. I hope you feel that, every single day, in everything I do now." "I do," Amara said honestly, meaning it completely. "I really do." They continued dancing together as the evening deepened around them, two people who had traveled through genuine difficulty towards something stronger and more authentic than what they had started with. Amara understood now, with complete clarity, that love required consistent action, not just quiet hope offered patiently into an uncertain void. She had waited once, faithfully and quietly, for affection that never seemed to arrive. But somewhere along that difficult journey, she had discovered something more valuable than simply waiting. She had discovered herself, fully and completely, and through that discovery, she had finally found a version of love worth continuing to build, together, one consistent day at a time.